Welcome to The Link Online. Well, we're back once again, and with me in studio is our regular Lynn Desjardins.
I'm not regular. I'm special and a fun girl. Are you going to call him regular?
Well, no, because he's been away for so long. So we're welcoming him back.
You're not regular. You're special.
You got to eat those fibers to get regular, you know.
Okay.
And your name would be, sir, whom we haven't seen for quite a while?
And I am Levon Sevuns, if you still remember me.
And on keyboards today, Marie-Claude Simard.
Hi, everybody.
And wondering what the heck is going on in the studio, in the control room, is Sylvain Lebrec. And back in the deep, dark reaches of the studio is a man who would much rather be on the golf course than here in the studio. Pierre Dutil is with us again. All right,
we all would rather be on the golf course. I don't golf, but I'd rather be on the golf course.
Well, the way the golf course is now, you might be skiing and not golfing.
That would be good. Yeah.
Because it was cold, yesterday?
Yeah, plus we have snow, which is unusual, this much snow at this time of year. But we digress.
We're going to digress now.
Coming up, I'll tell you about alleged sexual assault among students at a pricey private school in Toronto and the ensuing discussion about toxic masculinity.
Levon?
And I'll tell you about my recent trip to Norway, where I was covering NATO's largest war game since the end of the Cold War.
And we'll also be hearing about a family doctor and her concerns about the effects of the increasing costs of prescription drugs and how other countries are better at lowering costs than Canada. That's coming up on The Link Online. Lynn, you got to take care of that cough.
Cold season has started actually a couple of months ago, and I think I've had 2 already, in spite of the fact I have had the flu vaccine and pneumonia vaccine. But, it's really hard. I wash my hands all the time, but I guess...
Don't wash them that often.
You're I need to boost my immunity, expose myself to more germs. Okay.
That's right. You need germs. Right.
Okay.
But now we got a very serious story. This is a story that has been dominating the headlines in Canada this past week. Several teenage boys were arrested and charged in connection with alleged sexual assault at this private and expensive all-boys school in Toronto. That raised questions about why and how abuse occurs amongst students. And Lynn, you were looking into this.
Yep, I did, Mark. And in this case, it was a video of the alleged incidents that brought the matter to the attention of the public. Humberto Carollo is the executive director of White Ribbon. That's a nonprofit that was created to promote nonviolence and what he calls healthy masculinity. And this subject is a very important one for him. He says abuse and jockeying for dominance can happen in many male-dominated settings.
This is not unique to St. Michael's. It happen in all kinds of male-dominated environments and groups such as sports, police forces, armies, and so forth. It happens across cultures, and it's been happening for a very, very long time.
Why does it happen?
This has to do with the ways that boys and young men are socialized, and these are very unhealthy gender norms and behaviors. It's very toxic. It's a very unhealthy way of being a boy, of using masculinity. And so this is the way that boys are socialized to be dominant and in control and to win at all costs. And so many boys dominate over others in these types of settings, using violence and abuse and discrimination to establish a pecking order over their peers. It's used to increase their popularity, to establish their own ranking within these groups.
Who typically gets targeted?
Usually this is, it impacts younger students, younger boys, boys that are being welcomed or not so welcomed in this case to a group or an event. So it's an initiation ritual. It also disproportionately impacts members of the LGBTQ community because of homophobia, and also members of indigenous and racialized groups and people with disabilities. Essentially, anyone who doesn't fit into the so-called norm.
What can be the long-term effects for the victims?
this has significant impacts on a person's emotional and psychological and mental health. It has physical impacts as well in the case of sexual violence and assaults, and it wrecks a young person's self-esteem. And we've seen many boys and young men take their own lives. There's been so many examples of that over time because of bullying and exclusion and discriminatory and violent behaviors like these.
If it's so deeply entrenched, what can be done to stop this kind of behavior?
Yeah, it is deeply entrenched, and it's because there's a strong culture of silence surrounding it. And, we have to break that silence. We have to talk much more openly about this. And we all have a role to play, students, parents, and educators. I'm a dad of 3 teenage boys, and we often have these conversations at home. I talk to them about the importance of being respectful, inclusive, non-discriminatory, to be peaceful, kind, and gentle. So we need to break these kinds of toxic norms that boys are pressured and socialized into, and we need to share with them healthy alternatives. And and teachers and coaches have an important role to play around this as well in setting healthier expectations amongst their students and athletes, and to talk openly about this and deconstruct these kinds of scenarios and situations. We need to do a much better job to encourage respect, diversity, inclusion in our schools and in our communities.
So Humberto Carollo says the Me movement has been valuable because it has broken the silence over the abuse of women. He says this has actually made it easier for some men to speak out about the abuse they have suffered and to get a conversation going about the ways to stop it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is a situation that is still going on. I think the most recent news in this is that the principal of the school has resigned, isn't he?
The principal and the president of the school have both resigned.
We have to say the allegations have not been proven in court, but these young boys who are 14 and 15 years old will be charged. They'll be charged in juvenile court, and their identities are protected, of course, by Canadian law. We don't identify anyone under the age of 18. But certainly it's got people talking, I'm sure, in schools right across the country.
Right. So it's a very widespread phenomenon. I mean, we're just talking about this high school, but go to any university campus at a Frosh Week.
Yep.
I mean, it's the same kind of hazing. I was so surprised. I remember when I started university in Canada back in 1994, I was like, when I saw these rituals, this was something that we used to do in the Soviet military.
Oh, that's
the same hazing. I was dumbfounded that this kind of culture still exists here, and it's unfortunately it's being tolerated.
Yeah, the Soviet military initiations can be somewhat brutal, to say the least.
Brutal, humiliating, funny, but it's part of this toxic, masculine, hyper-masculine culture. But in universities, it's not just boys; it's girls too. Like the stuff that they have to endure just during the Frosh Week is unbelievable.
Yeah, some of it is silly. But some of it is obviously, as we've pointed out here, toxic and other things. It's initiation, and I'm not sure where initiation went from being kind of a fun thing to being toxic in many cases.
There is even when it's just silly, there's always this coercive element in it. It's like you don't want people who refuse to participate get shunned. So I think we as a society have to really start taking much more critical view of all this events that we've tolerated so far.
Indeed. Well, coming up next on the program in just a moment, we're going to be looking about the high cost of pharmaceuticals, prescription drugs in Canada. A new report has just come out in Canada describing the situation with prescription drugs here in this country, and it says Canadians, either individually or along with various private and public healthcare programs, will pay about $33 billion for prescriptions this year. There have been reports that the high cost means that a substantial number of Canadians are having to borrow money to pay for their prescriptions, or simply say they can't afford them at all. And in some cases, it's a question of either paying the rent and food or paying for the prescriptions. And obviously, the prescriptions are the ones that lose out on this. And the problem is, of course, if you're not taking your drugs, then there are other costs implied because you might end up in hospital and being admitted to hospital with high costs involved there as well. Now, Dr. Iris Gorfinkel is a family doctor and clinical researcher in Toronto who is concerned about the report and what she sees in her own practice. And in this excerpt of our conversation, she begins by describing how serious the cost situation is.
What we see is that drugs continue to be the second largest expenditure in the health budget. And this comes only after the physical structure of hospitals, the bricks and mortar. And what's interesting is that hepatitis C, a single disease, is taking a full 5% of that. It costs $100,000 a year to treat a single patient for this one disease. So, for example, if I'm treating my macular degeneration, I'm looking at a bill of $2,000 a month to treat it. That's just for me. So you can do the math. That comes to $24,000 a year for a single disease. That drains government coffers pretty darn quickly.
There have been reports, for example, that people are doing away with other things in their life in order to pay for drugs, even borrowing them. Have you, and possibly simply foregoing drugs because of the cost. Have you seen that in your practice?
Oh, 100%. Not only have I seen it, I've made mistakes personally in providing patients drugs that were just far too expensive for them, not realizing that. And what happens? They have to go into debt over the cost of these prescriptions if they choose to fill it. And if they don't fill it, that just increases downstream costs. They're more likely to wind up in an emergency room or being even admitted.
I imagine that drug costs around the world are increasing. How are other countries handling this, or is this something kind of unique to Canada?
Well, Canada is an interesting place. I mean, we've got a patchwork of private and public schemes that help pay for our drugs. So what happens is that each little patch is purchasing drugs for its own fiefdom. So as a result, they don't have the same bargaining power that, say, a national pharmacare program would have. You know, so I think if you take a look at places like Australia and New Zealand, they're literally paying a fraction, as in 25% of what we are currently paying. And another part of that solution is that physicians and nurse practitioners really have no idea how much drugs cost. And I ask you, how can we possibly do cost-effective prescribing when we don't even know what the drug costs? If doctors and nurse practitioners were given the price at the time, at the point of prescribing, the cost actually came up, doctors would learn costs and be able to make wiser choices. In the UK, it's amazing what they do. They actually go a step further. They nudge the doctor. Are you sure? The computer will ask the doctor, are you sure you want to prescribe this when you could be prescribing something else that costs less and does the same thing? So we need smarter systems, better use of technology to nudge us to make the right choices.
Why do you think we aren't moving towards a national pharmacare type of program or some other system like you've mentioned in Britain, where they have these computer-generated things saying, here's a cheaper alternative?
Well, it takes a really strong will. The changes that are happening in technology are overwhelming. And we need to take advantage of that. We need a strong will to do this, to make sure we're making it happen, because there are such heavy-duty implications for people. But with a strong will, we can make changes in the system, including national pharmacare, including drug cost transparency to physicians and nurse practitioners, in order to make our system far more sustainable.
And that was an excerpt of my conversation with Dr. Iris, a family doctor and clinical researcher in Toronto, and the full interview is in the highlights. I'm just glad that we don't have to, personally anyway, I don't have to go to the doctor for drugs and things because it's expensive.
It adds up very quickly.
We're lucky because here we are covered by, it depends. We have the choice of being covered by our private plan once you turn 65 or being covered by the public plan. And then you have to look at which one is more advantageous, which gives you the better coverage. But there's only a certain number of people who have drug insurance provided by their own employer, and not all provinces have drug plans. And this is something that is actually currently being discussed, is whether Canada should have a national drug plan.
Well, as Dr. Gorfinkel points out, the problem is that healthcare is a provincial concern.
Yes.
So when you have various private programs, private companies, and then you have like company programs like we have here as well, and then you have the provincial program in some cases. It's as she says, it's a patchwork of programs.
Yeah.
In the UK, for example, she mentioned the UK. It's one national system, the national health system. So I guess collectively 80 million or whatever the population has a lot more buying and bargaining power than each province separately.
Well, that's exactly what she said in the longer interview. Is that when you have a national system, you have a countrywide buying power as opposed to individuals or a private company which may have 1,000, 10,000 people, or a province which may have a couple of million people. It's not the same as many millions of people, sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, that's the situation with that. It's a serious one. And of course, if you have any thoughts on that, drop us a line here at RCI Net. And just want to say hello to Renato. Renato is looking at us?
Yeah, I think Renato is looking at us from somewhere from British Columbia.
All right, so hi.
Cool.
We also have Christoph.
Christoph, very good.
Christoph is probably watching us from Poland.
Yeah,
That's cool.
But then we say Dzień dobry. There we go. All right, coming up next on the program, we're going to be taking a look. Speaking of a country in the north, Levon, we're going to go there in just a minute with you. All right, we're looking at a lovely picture there, and that is you in the nice hat and the blue coat, and you were at a NATO huge military exercise in Norway. So, Levon, what's the story?
Well, I mean, it was quite an experience, I'll tell you. This was NATO's largest exercise since the end of the Cold War. So 50,000 troops from all 29 NATO countries, plus Sweden and Finland, took part in this exercise in central Norway and all over Scandinavia, actually. They were backed by some 250 aircraft, 65 ships, and up to 10,000 vehicles, tanks, trucks, all kinds of interesting...
Is that a Canadian LAV there?
That's a Canadian LAV there, and behind it is a Canadian or a German G-Wagen, but it belongs to the Canadian military. And, of course, Canada sent about 2,000 soldiers there. They sent 4 warships, 8 fighter jets, 2 spy planes, and an air refueling tanker. This was Canada's largest deployment since the end of the war in Afghanistan. And the scenario of the exercise was that Norway, as a NATO country, had triggered the so-called Article 5, the collective defense. So, which means that an attack on one NATO country is automatically considered an attack on all countries, and all these countries have to rush to help the ally in need. And, of course, NATO being an Arctic country, I was wondering whether this means that the exercise means that NATO is basically practicing for a possible war in the Arctic. And I had a chance to speak with NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, who's actually Norwegian himself. He's a former Norwegian Prime Minister. And I asked him that very question, and here's what he actually had to say.
NATO has always been in the Arctic. Half of Norway is located in the Arctic, and NATO has been in Norway since NATO was founded. Countries like Denmark, Iceland, of course, North America is in the Arctic. So at least big parts of North America. So NATO has always been in the Arctic. At the same time, we have always said that in the high north we are seeing low tensions. That was the case for many, many years. It's not the case to the same degree today, because we have seen significant increase of Russian military presence in the north with naval capabilities, reopening old military bases, and more submarines, and in general more Russian military presence. NATO is not mirroring exactly what Russia is doing, but of course we need to make sure that we are able to protect all allies, also those allies who have territory in the north, in the Arctic. And we have to make sure that we are able to keep the sea lines of communications open over the North Atlantic from North America to Europe. So we increase our presence in the Arctic with more modern maritime capabilities, ships, maritime air patrol, also patrol aircrafts, and also with strengthening our anti-submarine warfare capabilities. So we do a lot to make sure that we are able to deliver credible deterrence also in the Arctic.
And that was an excerpt of my conversations with NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. And it's part of my much bigger report that's coming out on December 3rd. And if you're interested in this issue, I would strongly encourage you to check it out. It's going to be a long feature magazine style of feature story with some videos, photos that I took and also got from Canadian Combat Camera. This is the photo kind of service of the Canadian military. I also traveled to the very north of Norway. It's a town called Kirkenes, and it was a very interesting contrast because you would think that this is a border town. It's literally like 7 kilometers from the Russian border. That, you know, if in central Norway they're nervous and preparing for a war with Russia, this town would be, you know, up in arms and, you know, waiting for Russians to invade. Nothing could be further from the truth. It's a very peaceful place. People there actually have very good relations with Russians, and they have a cross-border agreement when, and the Russian citizens from these border regions come in there to shop. Norwegians go to Russia to fill up their gas with much cheaper Russian gas.
Something like us crossing into the United States sometimes.
So it has that feel of this, you know, very close cross-border cooperation. I mean, things, of course, have changed a bit because of Crimea and Norway. Even though Norway is not part of the European Union, it has joined the European Union sanctions on Russia. But in other ways, you know, it's business as usual. The Russian fishing trawlers come to Norway, to that city, Kirkenes, for repairs and maintenance because, you know, Norwegian quality of work, I guess, is much better than what they would get in Russia or in China if they were to go there. You know, the crab fishery, their main point of departure is in this port. So there's a lot of cross-border contact there. So it was a very interesting contrast between, you know, central Norway with this, you know, huge number of troops and people, you know, concerned. Yeah. And you go up to this border town, which would be on the front line if, God forbid, ever a war were to happen. I mean, and it happened. This town was basically destroyed during Second World War when the Germans and the Soviet troops fought for that territory. It was very interesting. And it's another interesting thing about this town is that it's part of Norway that was liberated by Soviet troops during Second World War. So they still have some pretty good memories of Soviet soldiers because they didn't stay. Not unlike other parts of, you know, Central or Eastern Europe where Soviet Union stayed and, you know, turned them into the socialist satellite states. Yeah. In 1945, Soviet troops withdrew and they just restored the border. So it was a very interesting experience. So that you have these two possibilities. And quite a fascinating trip.
Now, I was looking at that. The soldiers were carrying huge backpacks. How much does that weigh, and what's in there? What are they carrying? I mean, because usually you see, in a situation like that when they're out on patrol in the movies and so on, it's pretty much just themselves and a little bit of ammunition and a rifle kind of thing. But these guys had huge packs on them.
Yeah, because they had to carry some winter gear with them because the weather there was very unpredictable. I mean, it had rained or snowed almost every day I was there. So you would wake up in the morning and you wouldn't know whether, it's going to be minus 15 or it's going to be plus 2.
Oh, so, it's like Canada.
Yeah, exactly. A bit of weather, though. I think that part of Norway gets a bit more rain do here. And it's one of the things that you heard from Canadian soldiers that, we're used to the cold, but it's a lot of weather here than it gets in Canada. The other thing is that, they have to carry all that food with them too, like their rations, and they come these boxes. You take, just the rations for two meals, and it's 2 boxes like things. It takes a good part of your backpack too. It's not an easy life.
And what people don't realize is how much ammunition weighs, because you get, like 50 rounds of ammunition. That's that's a substantial weight, and then you have to carry more of that. 100 rounds, man. That starts to weigh a lot, especially if you're operating a machine gun, for example.
Or a radio.
Or a radio, yeah.
Even though military radios are still pretty heavy. They're gotten smaller and lighter, but still quite a lot of weight.
Yeah. I believe the typical weight of a Canadian soldier's gear, what is it like? It's close to like 40 kilos or something?
Yeah.
So imagine you're carrying around another person on your back, which is another medium-sized person. That's 80. Gee, that's a lot of 40 kilos.
You can actually see in some of that video that we saw how they're walking this very deliberately, and they're really conserving their energy. You can see that if they go through that muddy field or something like that, or through snow, you really have to take care of your energies just to be able to carry that backpack that weighs about 80 pounds maybe.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because I was just thinking because just the other day I was walking to work and I have a very heavy backpack and I tripped on something and I fell down, and the weight of the backpack pushed my face into the ground and hurt me. I kind of hurt quite badly, actually. But I'm just thinking that's probably, they have to be careful as well, because if they lose their footing and fall down with the 40 kilos on their back, that can cause a lot of problems for them.
Yeah, and they have to run around. If they get into a firefight, you have to move. It can be physically very, very demanding. So.
Well, another thing I'm curious about is they're in the north in the snowy area, but they're still wearing like green uniforms as opposed to, say, whitish or something.
It depended on different militaries. So, for example, the Finns or the U.S. Marines, they had they had the pants that were white and the tops that were kind of camouflage. And it actually makes sense, because when you see them walking in the forest,
exactly,
it actually makes sense.
The ground is white, and
but
the
tops.
is
And the Canadians.
Don't forget, we sent our Canadians to the Middle Eastern desert in green.
Yes.
The brown tan desert.
Actually, you can also see on these pictures that camouflage actually is not bad even against the snow. If you're walking in a forest, you'd be hard to press to see someone.
Now, okay, well, that is part of your trip up to. Of course, as you said, it's going to be a very, very long feature item on December the 3rd on the website. Yeah. And Mary Claude, speaking of videos, you come across something very interesting as well.
Yes, on Facebook.
Well, you'll need to turn your microphone on.
Here it is. Somebody did it for me. Thank you. So, yes, I was just on Facebook yesterday, and I saw a video from CBC Docs, and it's actually from the vaults, and it's a video of Oscar Peterson, who plays our opening theme.
And this goes back to, I think, 1964 or something, doesn't it?
Let me just make sure everybody sees it.
Okay. There it is.
Is there a sound? Here it is.
1964.
First performance of Oscar Peterson of this piece, Canadiana Suite.
Yes, it's part of the Canadiana Suite.
But he's had amazing fingers, eh? Golly.
As the former producer of The Link, who chose this theme music back in, well, what was it, 2008, I think? Since 2008 that we've had this music, I think. I'm a huge fan of Oscar Peterson, and I think it represents Canadian culture quite magnificently.
And this particular part of the suite is called Place Saint-Henri, where he comes from in Montreal.
Now, wasn't there a big mural just painted on a building wall down in that area?
Yes. It's in in Griffintown, or Little Burgundy and Griffintown, where they meet. So,
which was his area, but it's not the painting of Oscar Peterson, though, right? It's the painting of the woman who taught him, I believe.
His sister.
His sister. Well, let's hear that again. Let's play it underneath her, shall we? Just
exactly.
Because
good idea.
It's just amazing when you think of the talent of that man and a couple of others from that area.
Oliver Jones.
Oliver Jones, yeah.
Who was also taught by his sister. So she's.
I'm trying to think. Sylvia or something.
I'm having a blank.
But anyway, so that is the actual live performance of our theme music, which we played here since, when was that again?
I think 2008. I have to look into my records, but it's been almost 10 years now.
All right.
Doesn't get old. Still sounds terrific.
Well, on that note, or those notes, that's all the time we have for the show for today. So for Lynn and Levon and Marie-Claude and Sylvain and Pierre, I'm Mark Montgomery. Take care until next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.